of like myself while we wait if there's more people. So this is the Indigenous peoples presentation, the one for like Florida. My name's Rebecca. I go to UCF and I study environmental engineering and I work in trips as a trip leader. My pronouns are she and her. And yeah, I'm gonna start sharing my screen and we'll get started. Sweet, can everyone see my screen? Give me like a nice thumbs up so I can see. We're all good and ready. Can everyone hear me good? Awesome. All right, so this is a presentation that I created with another trip leader, but unfortunately he couldn't be here today. But that's okay because I can still present. So this presentation I'm like super excited about because I think that having knowledge of the Indigenous peoples and the areas that you live and recreate in is like super important and also really important to share with others. I think that the connection that Indigenous people have with the land that they have been living on for years is just super special and something that should be protected. And a way that you can help do that is just by educating yourself and being able to educate others about their culture and their history. Yeah, before I jump in, does anybody have like any knowledge or experience with Indigenous people in Florida specifically that they would like to share?
I know that the Indigenous people of Florida are the Seminole tribe, and that they're sometimes called the unconquered Seminole tribe of Florida because there were 3 wars waged against the Seminole Nation, and the Seminole tribe beat back the United States government 3 times, and so they're the unconquered tribe of Florida.
Nice, thank you, Patrick. And then we got some stuff in the chat. Cindy said the Calusa tribe, yeah. So there's been a lot of tribes and Indigenous people in Florida's history. So we'll get to talk about a couple of them today, mainly the Seminoles. And yeah, so let's move on into just an overview of what I'm going to cover in my presentation today. So first, I'm going to start by talking about environmental justice in the US and like when that started, and then a brief history of people in Florida, Indigenous peoples in Florida, and then go into a little bit more detail about 2 or 3 tribes, and then we're going to talk about present day Indigenous peoples and land acknowledgements, and then I'll give you guys some resources that you can also use. All right, let's get into it. So in the late 70s and early 80s, communities of color across the country began organizing to prove unequal social, economic, and political power relationships made them more vulnerable to health and environmental threats than white communities. Specifically in Texas in 1979, Linda Bullard, a resident of Houston, alleged that the decision to put a landfill in her neighborhood was racially motivated. And her husband was a statistician who did a study and found that all 5 of Houston's landfills were all located in predominantly Black communities. So they decided to sue about this, and it was a groundbreaking lawsuit, and it like set the foundation for the environmental justice movement to use the legal system to basically regain some of those rights that they have. So environmental inequality wasn't really federally recognized until like the 1980s and 1990s, but it's been ongoing in the history of America. In 1983, the General Accounting Office released a study that confirmed just landfills and waste sites were typically just being placed in communities of color, and then therefore communities of color burdened with like a disproportionate amount of environmental risk as opposed to white communities. So, and then also you can see a report was done on the administration, and there's very little representation for communities of color, which is why that was happening to them. So then linking environmental justice and Indigenous people. Um, Environmental justice is of heightened importance to Indigenous people because the connection to the traditional homeland is at the heart of Native identity, and their lands are not being used or treated well. And that's unfortunate that they're being taken advantage of like that. So the US EPA defined environmental justice in the 80s, that it's that quote right there: the fair treatment of all races, incomes, and cultures with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, policies, and their meaningful involvement in the decision-making process of the government. Like, that's a lot of words. It's big, but if you want to break that down a little, it's just that we should all look to be represented more in the decision making process. So, not just white men, people of color, females, and then just to make sure that we all share the burden of the environmental impacts and it's not just all put on our communities of color. Um, so, yeah. Native Americans were forcibly removed from their homeland throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. This was a painful milestone in their history. And just like the rest of the country, Florida is home to Indigenous people and carries history of Native struggles and their successes in combating colonialism. Yes. So here's another quote. Not only do irresponsible and exploitive environmental policies harm the physical and financial health of Indigenous communities, they also cause spiritual harm by destroying the land held in a place of exceptional reverence for Indigenous peoples. So yeah, their land's super important, and a lot of the policies that are going on today harm it, and we need to protect it, and it's super important to do that. Yeah. So before I talk about brief history, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I'm going to show you guys a map. And it's a really good tool to use if you're trying to research Indigenous peoples in the area that you're living or recreating. It's called nativeland.ca. I'm going to start sharing my screen again. So the disclaimer didn't pop up, but an important disclaimer that they have is that this map, you can see there's a lot of like overlap in the different areas, but maps aren't always exact and they're not meant to be exact. So just always keep that in mind when you're looking at maps of Indigenous lands. So just because like they might have very distinct like borders, that's not usually the case, because tribes often like shared land together. So you can see that a bunch of these overlap. So that could mean they're sharing land, and then wars between tribes often change borders. And then as well as some tribes were semi-nomadic, which means throughout the year they would occupy different lands. Also, colonization had like a very big impact on, had a very big impact on just basically the map making and their lands, because many people were displaced from the lands that their ancestors originally occupied. And then maps were drawn like later in history. So a lot of the culture, like the Indigenous peoples really didn't make maps. That wasn't like something they did. They just knew their land and they knew it was theirs. So a lot of the maps were constructed off of like oral histories from Indigenous people, or they're made from Europeans coming over and making maps after like colonization has already happened. So like a lot of maps are really just educated guesses at where these people's lands are. Keep in mind, like, they're like pretty good educated guesses, but like just like keep that in mind when you're looking at a map. So as you can see, there's numerous tribes in Florida. So we have the Seminole tribe is this big like blue that basically covers all of Florida. And then we have Timucua, Muskogee up here, and then a bunch down south as well. All right. So back to the presentation. So knowing at least some history is super important. So I'm going to go over a brief history. And this is just like very general for a bunch of different tribes. So the continent of North America has been inhabited by people for tens of thousands of years. Indigenous people were the first to establish roots in Florida some 12,000 years ago. First European contact was in the early 1500s. So that was the Spanish, the English, and the French began establishing settlements in Southeast America. So with the Europeans came disease and war, and that devastated native communities and populations. Um, so with that, in the 1700s and the 1800s, so when America became America and it was no longer just the Spanish and the English and the French over here, the US made treaties with indigenous people, but a lot of them were broken or not held up by the US government. And then we had things like the Indian Removal Act, which basically the US government acted to kill or move all the indigenous people off their land and west because they wanted this land for Americans and for American development. And so with that, the native community in Florida fought back, like Patrick was talking about with the Seminole Wars. There are three of them. We'll get more into the Seminole Wars when we talk about the Seminoles, though. And then in the 1900s and 2000s, um, survivors of all of the Removal Act, the wars, were able to survive by selling hides and fish, and they kind of made some money off of the tourism that started to happen in Florida. But by any means, it wasn't great for them. They were treated as like orphan wards by the federal government. Indigenous people actually weren't given citizenship in America until like 1934, I think. They weren't given those rights. Meanwhile, they've lived here longer than any American has. Yeah. Today, the indigenous people of Florida continue to grow and prosper with growing population of tribal members and reservations. Cool. So the first tribe I want to talk about is the Appalachee. They lived in Northwest Florida since 1000 AD. Prior to European contact, they had a powerful chiefdom living in widely dispersed villages. They're among the first tribes encountered by the European explorers, and many died defending their land or from disease brought by the Europeans. So they farmed corn, beans, squash, hunted deer and small game, and gathered nuts and berries. Right now, there are currently some descendants in Louisiana, and they're seeking tribal recognition from the state and federal government. All right, the Timucua, they were in north central Florida and southern Georgia. They were semi-nomadic. They hunted game, farmed squash and corn, beans, melons, root vegetables, and gathered wild fruits. Something cool that I learned about them is they practice prescribed burns, and that's something that we still do today for forest and land management. So yeah, so they would do slash and burn, where they would burn certain land certain areas to return nutrients to the soil so then they can grow again. Yeah. So again, with European contact came war, disease, and slavery. So their population was decimated. Survivors either joined other tribes like the Seminoles or immigrated somewhere else. They're now considered an extinct tribe. All right, moving on. The unconquered Seminole tribe of Florida. So the Seminole tribe is comprised of peoples from various tribes across Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. They joined together to defend their land, their homes, people, and culture. So this included Creeks, Muskogee, and Calusa peoples. So the Seminole Wars, what Patrick was mentioning, they fought tirelessly to defend their land and culture and ways of life when the US government sought out to kill or relocate them west. The Seminoles persevered and remained in Florida unconquered. They continue to grow and prosper today. They have more than 5,000 tribal members, and they were federally recognized as a tribe by the US in 1957. They have their own government, schools, courts, successful businesses, and international franchises, and they also have 6 reservations across South Florida. Um, the languages that they still speak today are Muskogee and Mizzouki. So those are just 2 of the surviving dialects. There are many more, but that's what survived until today. Um, so tradition, Seminole culture, religious and recreation activities, as well as commercial endeavors, are dependent on a healthy ecosystem. So the Seminoles have been acting to help provide that. So with the Everglades, they have an Everglades Restoration Initiative. Um, they saw the decline in the Everglades and recognized that they also had to be a part of mitigating impacts of man on the natural system. Um, so it was designed to protect their land and water and ensure a sustainable cultural and economic future for the tribe. Cool. So these are some more tribes that we're not going to have a ton of time to talk about today. But yeah, there's just so many more. They're located all over Florida. So if you have time, take your own time, do some research. I just want to mention them because they're also important. We just definitely don't have enough time to cover all of these in their culture. Okay, so present day Indigenous tribes. So currently in the state of Florida, we have 2 federally recognized tribes, and that is the Seminole tribe and the Muskogee tribe. Federally recognized tribes mean that the US government, is on has a relationship with the tribe of government. So basically, these tribes can have their own government, and they possess inherent rights and are entitled to receive certain protections. They're eligible for funding and services from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And in the US today, there are more than 500 federally recognized tribes. But with that being said, there are still other tribes that still call Florida home. They're just not recognized federally. So yeah, it's important to also um, know about those tribes as well. And then to get federally recognized, you have to go through certain processes, and many of these tribes are probably trying to do that right now. Cool. All right. So, land acknowledgement. This is something we can do with our leadership positions in the outdoor industry. I've been seeing it a lot more recently in 2020 and 2021, and I think that's super cool. I know in our program we try to do it with every trip that we go on, and we make sure with every post on Instagram that we're acknowledging that the land that we recreate on wasn't always ours and that there were previous caretakers. So it's important to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. So how do you go about doing a land acknowledgement? So I have 5 steps listed out, and these are really helpful, especially if you don't know where to start. And the first thing is to start with self-reflection. You want to think, why am I doing this? Why is this important? And it starts with you. Like I think it's really important just to recognize that, yeah, we are so blessed to be able to recreate here, but we weren't the original caretakers, and this land did belong to other peoples. And then do your homework, like do research, know what indigenous peoples resided on the land that you're on, learn a little bit about their culture and about their history. You want to use appropriate language, and with that you want to use past, present and future tenses, and don't just like dance around words like genocide or stuff like that, because that did happen and we need to recognize that that happened and come to terms with it. And then you want to focus on positivity as well of who indigenous people are today. I have an example of a land acknowledgement that Vince wrote for one of our trips where we went kayaking on Lake Baldwin in Winter Park, Florida. So I'm gonna like go through that just so you guys have an example and can kind of like base your other land acknowledgements off of this as well. So I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land and waters we are experiencing. This space has not always been developed. In fact, it was not long ago that Native people swam in this water and grew food from this land. The Seminole Tribe of Florida is a living community that has populated Native America for thousands of years, with Muskogee ancestors recorded 12,000 years ago in the southeastern region of the American continent. In that great timeline, it was only within the last 500 years that the people were disturbed by Europeans. Since the 15th century, there has been forced removal and mass genocide of these Native communities. Seminole tribe land historically extends across the entire state of Florida. Over the past several centuries, the colonial oppressive behavior of the US has forced indigenous people into small zones of land. Even so, the Seminole tribe thrives today in Tampa, Brighton, Big Cypress, and Hollywood, Florida, totaling 90,000 acres of land with over 5,000 tribal members. They speak Muskogee and Mississauga languages. I will now ask for a moment of silence or reflection as we acknowledge the Seminole Tribe of Florida and their history and their ongoing protection of land and water that we stand on today. Cool, thanks guys for doing that. Yeah, that's about the end of my presentation. It went by really fast. I think I went really fast, but that's okay. So these are all the resources that we used. Feel free to use them. Yeah, if you have any questions or like you want to discuss anything, we got plenty of time to do that. Yeah.
That was awesome, Becky. I thought it was. I think it's really cool just to think about like why it's important to do those land acknowledgements. Like you said, it's like a lot of times if you just do it because it's what hashtag outdoorsy people are doing right now, then that's probably not the best reason to do it. Like you said, start with self-reflection and being like, if I'm doing this to be hashtag outdoorsy like all the rest of the people that are doing it, then reevaluate and think like, okay, why am I doing this? Is my point to like understand the culture and understand what has brought me to where I am in history? I think then that's the right way to go about it. So I like that you said that.
Thanks, Pat.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or what's something that you learned that you didn't really have like any background in before that you'll definitely take with you to your programs?
I personally am not like, I had no idea that this was a thing, like that people were trying to get more into this. I'm not on social media, so I guess I missed that. But at Georgia Southern, where I go, we do not like talk about this. So I'm definitely going to bring this back to our program. We have a bunch of trips like near the coast, so I guess that kind of blends in with like Florida. So um, that was really, really like eye-opening, seeing that we should be respecting this and we should be talking about this more, and it shouldn't be something that we're just like ignoring or just literally not being aware of.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
A fun fact that I learned recently was the Seminole tribe also took in slaves that were runaways or recently freed slaves, and they were like a refuge for either recently released runaway slaves or, sorry, someone else is entering the waiting room, but or just other people that were in need, right? And so like they were taking on all of these other people that just needed a refuge, and that the Seminole tribe was there for him. So I thought that was super cool.
Adding on that, there's an old like mythical folklore from Florida involving the Seminole tribe and them taking in a former slave in the Ocala region. There's like a natural spring middle of nowhere called Blue Hole Springs, and then the character is called Uncle Monday. And so it's just a piece of Florida like folklore that's really interesting. And then also, Rebecca, thank you for that example. That was really helpful to show us how we can do that ourselves for our programs.
Yeah, it doesn't always have to be that long. It could just be something as simple as like, hey, I want to recognize that these lands did originally belong to the Seminole tribe of Florida. When we did it on our trip, we just like stopped in the middle of the water while we were kayaking and just kind of took a moment to reflect. It was really nice, and the participants definitely enjoyed it. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, if there's no more questions or comments or anything like that, Anna just dropped the evaluation in the chat right now. We would really appreciate it if you filled that out. That gives really good feedback for one, Becky over here, but also us on the Flora Planning Committee, just to see like what you guys want more of next year, when hopefully we can do this in person. Did anybody else have anything they wanted to add? All right, well, Becky, thank you so much, though. It was a really great and insightful presentation that, let us appreciate where we stand a little bit more. So thank you so much. Our next presentation is going to be at 3 o'clock, and that is Kaylee Buckner from the University of Florida. So we're excited for it. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, guys.